Are we all just good people?
I don't think anybody really believes that.
Hitler was elected.
It's true. Hitler was elected as Chancellor of Germany. He was not, he did not take power in a coup. There was a guy who was trying to find out what God's will for his life was. So he puts his Bible on the windowsill and he waits for the wind to blow. It lands on the passage where it says, Judas hung himself. And he's like, oh, that's not a great verse. And then he waits again and he puts his finger on the Bible and go and do likewise.
This is
Disruption.
Welcome to the Disruption Podcast, everybody. I'm your host, Alex Sikma.
I'm Stefan Walicord.
And today we have our third installment of our philosophical arguments for God. And Stefan can bring us up to speed with where we've been and where we are with this current episode.
Absolutely. Episode 47 was the cosmological argument. It basically asks the question, why is there anything? Why does stuff exist? And it posits that the existence of God is necessary to explain the existence of anything that exists at all in the universe. Episode 48 was our coverage of the epistemological argument. How can we as humans, with human minds, say that we can reliably observe the world outside of us? And the episode argued essentially that we need God, a God who made us and who made the universe to be understood by us, to be able to reliably say that we can understand the world. Today's episode is the third episode in our little philosophical mini-series for arguments for the existence of God. In fact, not just arguments for the existence of God, but arguments for the necessity of God. And this episode focuses on the moral argument. How can we know what's right? Is it possible to know what's not right without the existence of God, without his revelation in Scripture, and without something grounding right and wrong outside of our personal experiences, opinions, political systems, and things like that? It's a big question, I think, and I'm really excited to dig into it.
Yeah, so when we start with this, I think it's logical to maybe go with the foundation. So like, what's our foundation for morality?
It's a big question. We live in a very moral world in a certain sense, right? I mean, people are always talking about how they're wronged. People are always talking about what's wrong with the world. People are always talking about what's wrong with society, how this group of people is bad and immoral.
Yeah.
This group of people is bad and immoral.
Well, they always bring that up too. I think we live in a very super moral society where people care about, I mean, the Black Lives Matter thing, the racism, especially like in 2020. I think a lot of people were up in arms about that.
Yeah, like in a social justice context.
Social justice.
Big topic of conversation, yeah.
Right. So I think it's on everybody's minds, which is
absolutely
interesting.
And I feel like it's kind of funny that everybody agrees that the world is in terrible shape and the world is going down, which is like, oh, you'd think the world is super not moral. But I think in a certain sense, the fact that everybody believes the world is going down is an indication that we live in a super moral world full of people who care about the morality of things.
Yeah.
The problem is that they don't agree on what is and isn't moral on a big picture kind of way.
Yeah, they're very sensitive, but they're still...
Yeah, they're very conscientious.
Yeah, are conscientious.
I remember somebody saying that, New England is famous for having its historical Puritans, right? And, they had a very strong sense of this is what's right, this is how to live, this is what it means to be godly. And the reputation they got was like they were kind of a very strict and upset about everything everybody does. And I remember somebody commenting, New England is now extremely secular. It is extremely humanistic nowadays, but it's still extremely Puritan because they still have super strong opinions about the right way to live your life. They're just really secular, post-Christian opinions now.
Interesting.
Which is kind of different than what you'd expect and think. It's an interesting fruit of an interesting culture, but I'm sure we'll dig into some of that.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about the foundation for morality.
Of morality.
Yeah. So it is the thesis, so to speak, of this episode, that morality demands God. The existence of any kind of a moral system requires a source of right and wrong, a transcendent underpinning that's bigger than our opinions, that's bigger than how we just feel, and that we need that to be able to see and do anything in the world and evaluate reliably what of that is good and what of that isn't good. So that's the Christian perspective for founding morality. The non-Christian perspective obviously varies. You obviously have other theistic traditions like Islam and Judaism that have a similar sense of morality is founded in God. They have disagreements about who God is, what he's like, what he's done, etc. But their argument is fundamentally the same. What the Christian perspective, or broadly the theistic perspective, stands in very stark contrast to is the secular humanist perspective. The general idea that we are living in a world where religion isn't really needed to make human decisions, to know what's right and wrong, to know what we need to do with our lives, things like that.
Well, yeah, aren't we all just good people?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think anybody really believes that, because if you open a history book, you're going to see so many examples of horrible things human beings have done, and not just like small groups of people. I mean, you look at the entirety of like the German people during the Second World War. It's not very pretty. It's a bunch of average people that went along with a system of genocide and destruction of people groups, right? You have every day you're coming across people who annoy you. Every day you're coming across people who have wronged you. You are constantly probably wronging other people, right? Aren't we all just moral? Well, yes, we're all moral creatures. We all believe something is right. We all believe something is wrong. But let's be honest, we don't live up to our own morality. We don't live up to the moralities of others. So just saying we don't need morality, we're all moral, is just kind of a lame cop-out. I mean, we're obviously not, or else we wouldn't be having this discussion. If everyone were moral, what's the point of arguing about morality?
So do we need a transcendent source of what's right and wrong? Or do we need something bigger than ourselves?
I absolutely think we do. And I think...
What's the importance of that?
Right. So maybe we should talk about what the word transcendent means, because it's... What do we call them? $5 words, right?
Yeah. These are big words.
Is a word that we use to describe something that's bigger than us, right? Like there's you, there's me, there's people, there's people's opinions, right? Great stuff. Opinions, important to have. I encourage you to have them. Good opinions, preferably. But, I mean, when we're talking about transcendent morality, we're talking about a set of rules for what is right, what is wrong, and how we can judge between right and wrong for people. For ourselves, for societies as a whole, for systems of thought, stuff like that. When we say we want a transcendent morality, what we say, or when we say we need a transcendent morality, what we're trying to say with that is that the morality that we need can't just be based on things that come and go, like your feelings, or things that just crop up at one point and then go away, right? Stuff that is inside our average life experience, stuff that flows through time, through society. We need something that is other, beyond us. We need something that's more than just the physical stuff that we see, the stuff that we can come up with. Something that is real and beyond this world.
Yeah. Do we need this objectivity? Like, objectivity? Do we need something like, I mean, I just think, if we could just look at this from a secular humanist standpoint, I feel like if we just have people, I think we can get away with it. Like, I think we can...
Again, the sense of voting for what's right and wrong.
Yeah, social consensus.
Social consensus. Social consensus is great.
Right?
The problem is just because you have people agreeing on something has no bearing on whether it's right or wrong. Like, if all of us in this room right now voted to kill Alex, that would be the social consensus within the context of this room. We do not encourage murder. This is a no murder podcast. Don't do murder. But let's say we all decided, the three of us voted that Alex was going to be murdered by the end of the day.
Mafia.
Yes. Unfortunately, democratically speaking, that would be A-okay. If you're going to say morality is just based on consensus, because the consensus in the group, by a pretty strong majority, is that it's A-okay.
Hitler was elected.
It's true. Hitler was elected as Chancellor of Germany. He was not. He did not take power in a coup. The people decided democratically that he would be the best leader to lead Germany. What does that say about social consensus? Yeah. And you could say, well, okay, their social consensus was fine. Ours is better and superior. And it's like, well, I'm sure they thought the same thing, right? And just because we think it's wrong now to murder people, what if that changes? What if the consensus changes? Throughout history, societies have changed their mind on stuff all the time, right? We need something where we can actually say, no, that's wrong. Because otherwise, what you have to say is that anytime within a specific context, you get a group of people agreeing to something, that is right. If you root morality in the opinions and perspectives of people agreeing, then as soon as that agreement changes, right and wrong change. And murder can become A-okay.
Yeah.
For example, and I'm using an extreme example with murder, fraud, sexual immorality of various kinds, all of that stuff, societies change their minds on them all the time. Do we really want to say that something was right in the 1800s and is not right now? What about slavery? The social consensus in the Confederate States of America was that slavery is fine. It's not morally problematic, right? Do we really want to give the ground that because they had a consensus, it's okay, but now the consensus is that it's wrong? Did what's right and wrong change? Or is there an actual standard of what is right and wrong? And our opinions on it are either getting closer or further away. Mm-hmm. I think we need something beyond ourselves. And that's why I think we must see the necessity of God for any kinds of moral argumentation. Mm-hmm. And as humans, I don't think we can live without morality. So there's an interesting quote that is incorrectly attributed to Benjamin Franklin. Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting what's for dinner. Now, democracy is great. I think voting is a good thing. It is near election time. By the time this episode will come out, the election will be over, and you'll get to see all manner of exciting things happening in the streets of America.
We encourage you to vote, by the way.
It'll be too late by the time we're out. I mean, anyways, the problem is democracy doesn't do a good job telling us what's right. It does a good job telling us what people's opinion are, and that can help us make leadership decisions, but it doesn't tell us if those people are right about what they're deciding. Mm-hmm. So consensus changes over time, and at the end of the day, when you have any kind of talk about using democracy to decide things, there's going to be a minority whose will is going to be overruled, and you can't just overrule people's opinions and not have a justification for it, especially when it comes to right and wrong. I can't just say my opinion on right and wrong is better than your opinion on right and wrong because there's more of me. And your will deserves to be pushed down by the power of the state or whatever.
Yeah. So, but then this kind of flows into our power play question because you mentioned power. What's wrong with just saying, you know what, I'm right and you're wrong and I'm just going to punch you out?
Yeah. I mean,
impose it on people, it's just like, what wrong is, just impose it on people.
Yes. Right? Well, that's great if you're right about what you're imposing on people. So I think we need to talk a little bit about law in general. What is law? Well, law is when humans make rules for how to be in an organized society and enforce those rules by essentially state violence to some extent. Behind every law is the implication if you don't cooperate, we have the right and the ability to inflict violence on you. So police officers, the military, stuff like that. And I think that's all good and I think biblically justified. So here's the thing. If you're imposing your morality by force and you're confident that your morality is correct, that really has no bearing on whether or not your morality is correct, just because you're confident that your morality is correct. Right. Because the question is, why are you confident? That's the question we're all asking. You may agree that it's wrong to murder people and you may put that law down by violent force. Say murder is wrong and we punish people who commit murder, right? You might do that.
This is why we have police officers.
This is why we have police officers and capital punishment. But the question we are asking is, why do we know that murder is wrong?
It goes back to that.
We all kind of agree that murder is wrong, but we're asking a philosophy question here. Why do we believe that murder is wrong? And that's where that transcendent divine morality comes in that we're going to talk more about later. Power doesn't change goodness, and politically expressing your opinion doesn't make it any less of an opinion.
Yeah. We evolved, right? Can it just be something that evolved with us?
Sure.
Can it just be, obviously, we're here today by a bunch of evolutionary, millions of years, accident, the evolutionary process. This is how we got morality,
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, you have the controversy between the compatibility of Christianity and evolution, which is not a can of worms that I'm necessarily wanting to open today. But regardless, the basic argument is that morality came from nature. It developed. It comes out of the natural world, right? So we know what's right and wrong just because of our nature. We know what's right and wrong just because that's how our biology ended up being by virtue of selective processes or whatever, things like that. It's in our genome. It's all in there somewhere. And that's why we feel bad when we do bad things. It's just force of habit and the pressures of time and environment on genetics. Our need to exist together as a society, as herd animals, created our morality. That's the argument, basically, that you'll often get. from a secularist to say, okay, no, you don't really need a transcendent morality. We have morality in nature. Do you really want to sign up for nature-based morality? Like, have you guys seen nature? Nature's awful. Nature sucks. Things are getting killed out there all the time. I mean, we talk about predation. We talk about violence. We talk, even about, sexual violence in animals obviously has a very different context than it has in humans. Just because we see something happening in the natural world, nobody thinks that just because it happens in nature, it's okay among humans, right? Unless you have a very messed up moral sense. So be careful with arguments like that. Be very careful with arguments like that, because you're really opening up a can of worms.
There's a secular behaviorist who was, this is an example brought up by Tim Keller. I forgot what her name was that he used as an example, but she basically went out and was going to, reconnect with nature again, because humanity is, awful or whatever. And
humanity is awful. Nature.
So nature is great.
Oh,
So if we just went back to nature, then we would be our true selves, and everything would be wonderful and everything would be great. So she was out there, observing nature and all this other stuff. Finds this water bug, a giant water bug, attack a frog, and then stick its beak in its brain and suck out the brain, and then the frog just collapses.
Lovely.
She was horrified.
Yeah.
She couldn't get over it, and just writes this paper, and she's either we are totally wrong, either we are so far off and we need to go back to nature and get lobotomies and just sit on the creek, just being content with being prey or preying on other creatures, or there's something wrong with us. Either something wrong with us or there's something wrong with them, and we have no reference.
Exactly.
But either way, we can't figure this out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And beyond that, just because something is biologically embedded in you, does that really mean it's right? Constantly, we're transcending our biology, right? We're choosing not to do things that our bodies are telling us to do. We're choosing not to eat junk food. We're choosing not to engage in behaviors that are socially unacceptable in public. We're constantly saying no to our biology. We're constantly denying ourselves. That's part of what makes civilization work, right? If we didn't say no to our bodies and our instincts a lot of the time, what kind of a civilization would we have? So to claim that morality can be derived from nature is really problematic. The discussion about nature and morality gets brought up by conservatives a lot of the time as well. And it's certain, for example, homosexual behaviors aren't in nature and therefore they're wrong. And then it'll be well, no, this penguins are gay, so that means it's A-okay. And I feel like conservatives should really know better about making that argument, because at the end of the day, nobody cares what the penguins are doing when our arguments are about what's right and wrong, okay?
Interesting.
Because the penguins are probably raping each other, and we're not making our decisions about sexual violence based on penguin behaviors. Why should we make any of our decisions, no matter whether the argument is conservative or socially liberal? Making arguments from nature is generally problematic because nature is messed up. And everybody sees that. Everybody knows that. But we don't have another reference frame other than nature if you're a naturalist. If you believe nature is all there is, where else are you getting your morality,
Yeah.
So that's the problem with arguments for morality from nature.
See, that's really interesting, because if you're from the Christian perspective on this one, you can see that, well, obviously, we're born in sin. So we are born by nature. Yeah. It is sinful. So you just can't go by nature. If you are under the biblical worldview, you can't.
And as Christians, we also believe that nature itself is fallen. It's not necessarily in the state that it's intended to be in, that it was created in, right? There is a sense of corruption. Things are wrong with the natural world, right? And I think we all have a sort of instinctual sense of that. I think we all have this belief, okay, something about how this life is not right, is not how it ought to be. It ought to be better. It ought to be different. It has so much potential to be amazing, yet it is so broken in so many different ways. And I think that calls us back to the doctrine of creation, right, and to the doctrine of the fall, this reminder that, yes, this is a good world, but it's a broken good world.
Yeah.
So our preferences, our politics, and our biology don't really do the trick to help us make moral decisions.
Yeah. So where do we turn?
Well, there's nothing in the world itself. in this world as we experience it that can give us morality, right? Because the opinions of people are constantly changing and they're not reliable. And who says the opinions of one person are better than the opinions of another person, objectively speaking? By what standard do we do morality? By what standard do we judge something as right and wrong? And we all have strong beliefs that we should judge certain things as right and wrong, but we need some ruler, some guideline, something bigger than ourselves to do that. We need something steady and unchanging. We need a morality that comes from beyond us, that comes from God. So let's pivot a little bit and look at the biblical narrative of right and wrong and the origin of mankind. In the Bible, God creates man. Our morals are derived from the same person who gave us purpose, right? Our morality is derived from our teleology. So our sense of right and wrong is derived from our purpose, and it's derived from the person who gave us purpose, right? It reflects him who gave us purpose.
First of all, what's teleology?
Yes. So teleology is the study of purpose. What is the purpose? What is the goal? What is the direction of mankind, right? So telos is like purpose, right?
Okay.
So when we talk about teleology, we're talking about what man is made for, right? And morality is really relevant to that because how man should live is going to depend on what he's made for, right? If we were created to stack butter, the morally right thing for us to do would be to spend as much of our time as possible stacking butter. Now, I don't know if anybody that believes that mankind was created to stack butter, but if you did, that would be a really logical conclusion. From that doctrine of creation, you get that teleology. From that teleology, you get that morality. So our teleology, biblically speaking, based on what the Bible tells us, our purpose is to bring glory to God, to honor him, to reflect him, right? So all morality is derived from God himself. Our purpose, our intention for existing, our characteristics reflect his characteristics, right? So if divine law reflects the divine person, then these laws are perfect, then that divine morality is perfect.
So when we're talking about divine reality, what are those two commands that are talked about in the Bible that really encapsulate the law?
So the divine morality, the specific, the nuts and bolts of what Christians are talking about when they talk about that is the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two greatest commandments, right? And if you really look back at where they're coming from, they're pretty much like the short Cliff's Notes versions of the Ten Commandments, essentially, right? And the Ten Commandments reflects what God is like and what he wants us to be like so that we can reflect his goodness, right? So that's kind of when we talk about the Christian morality, that's like the short version of it, essentially. That's like the most distilled form, that God is our highest and everything should be directed towards him. Like St. Augustine said, he should be our highest love, and all our other loves should be subservient to that. And then, because we love God, we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves.
Okay, but I mean, I know that you got this from the Bible and everything, but can't non-Christians be moral too?
Oh, absolutely. Sort of. We're gonna kind of discuss that a little bit. It's an interesting one. So obviously, non-Christians can be moral. I don't think that you can seriously dispute that. Non-Christians can behave in a way that's moral in civilized society. And I mean, on the flip side, there are so many Christians who behave in, or at least self-proclaimed Christians who behave in a way that's like extremely immoral, right? I mean, if you're paying attention to the news, the amount of evangelical pastors that are publicly being called out for their failures. I mean, just recently we had David Platt, we had Lawson, people like that.
Yeah, Stephen
Big
Lawson.
people in the evangelical world who were shown to have serious moral failings. And these were self-declared Christians, right? So it's not this dichotomy of Christians are moral, everyone else is horrible. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is Christians having a good answer to why morality, right? A non-Christian can want to be moral. And a non-Christian is created in the image of God. He has a conscience. He has a sense of the divine, even if he doesn't necessarily recognize it. And a Christian has all those same things, right? Those are built into what it means to be a human. And even though we're fallen, even though we're corrupted, even though a lot of the times we want bad things, we still have something inside us that's reminding us, no, this is wrong. No, this is wrong. We have what's called common grace that's restraining our sense of evil, right? Our desire to fulfill our own selfishness at the expense of other people. So yes, a non-Christian can be moral in like a broad sense, right? To the same extent that a Christian who has a good philosophical reason for morality can be very immoral, especially to the extent that he doesn't live into the scriptures and what's talked about in the scriptures and the law of God that reflects his character.
So obviously, like, morality can be found outside the Bible, but let's just say, what about insert icky Bible thing?
Oh, yeah.
The Bible says do that, for example, and then God tells Hosea, to a prophet, to marry a prostitute.
Yeah.
And then God uses that to kind of speak his message against Israel.
Yes. The Bible is full of all sorts of controversial occurrences.
You have a funny story about this, though, about taking, I don't know, it kind of has to do with taking the Bible out of context.
Verses out of context, yeah.
Yeah, share that.
So there was a guy, and it's funny because I recently heard this brought up in a sermon again, which is very cool. So I get to retell the story. There was a guy who was trying to find out what God's will for his life was. So he puts his Bible on the windowsill, and he waits for the wind to blow and to turn the pages of the Bible so that he knows what to do with his life.
Yes.
And it lands on the passage where it says, Judas hung himself. And he's like, oh, that's not a great verse. And then he waits again, the wind blows, and he puts his finger on the Bible and reads the next verse and says, go and do likewise. And then the wind blows again, and he picks the next verse. He's like, well, third time's the charm. Whatsoever you do, do quickly. So, I mean, it's very easy to get dumb ideas out of the Bible if you're not using your brain. There's a lot of things in the Bible that happen where the Bible says this happened. That doesn't mean this is the thing that you should also do, right?
Yeah. So there's a difference between that, right? You've got things that were given in the Bible for certain people. And then
proscriptive that are like commands, and then descriptive that are just telling you what happened, right?
But you don't have to do them necessarily.
Yes. Okay. Like, for example, Hosea was told by God to marry a prostitute as part of the way that he talked about how God is married to his people who are unfaithful to him, right? Which is an amazing metaphor, and it's an amazing story of grace. You should read the book of Hosea. It's in the Bible. Great stuff. Strongly recommended. 10 out of 10. 5 stars.
5 stars.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's prescriptive for you. I don't necessarily encourage you to marry women who are living actively in lives of immorality. That's life advice from Stefan. Marry moral people, but
marry people with a strong sense of morality. So, yeah,
that's right. There's also the sense that things are also happening in a cultural context, right? In the Old Testament, you have a lot of things that are happening in a very specific culture that seem absurd and out of the world to us, right? You have a whole episode on disruption dealing with slavery in the Old Testament, right? And I mean, in the modern Christian world, it's obviously acknowledged that, especially what happened in America in the 1800s, race-based chattel slavery is seen as immoral. And that's biblically supported as well, but the slavery in the Old Testament is happening in a very different kind of context. It's kind of it's a temporary debt-based bond-servant relationship. So, you really have to read things in the context of what they happened, right? There's a whole disruption episode on that you can get back to. And sometimes in the Bible, God does something that we're not okay with, but we have to acknowledge the fact that God's standard for how humans behave toward each other and how God behaves towards humans aren't necessarily the same thing. And I kind of want to pivot back a little bit, talking about Christian morality and non-Christian morality. Christians and non-Christians, especially in the modern West, have a very strong agreement on what is wrong. You shouldn't leave children to die. You should protect the orphan and the widow. It's good to help the poor. The strong should serve the weak, right? Those are all fundamentally Christian ideas, morally speaking, right? The secular world largely inherited those ideas, but the secular world has the problem that it can no longer ground them in anything outside of their preferences, right? The secular post-Christian West has essentially borrowed the worldview of Christianity and then critiqued Christianity for not living up to its own worldview.
Right.
Philosophically, they're in a worse spot than we are because they're making fun of us for not living up to our rules. They say they're living up to them, but they don't have a way to justify why those rules are even there.
So right? in a weird way, they're still affirming Christianity.
In an extremely weird way, and this is something the historian Tom Holland talks about, not to be confused with the actor who plays Spider-Man.
Yeah, not Tom Holland.
Yes, Tom Holland, the historian, wrote a book called Dominion, where he argues that so much of the modern world is Christian, not knowing that it's Christian, but it's Christian in the sense that it's so strongly influenced by the values of Jesus Christ of Nazareth.
Yeah.
And Friedrich Nietzsche critiqued this idea. Friedrich Nietzsche, famous philosopher, very dead, was famous for the quote, "God is dead." And it's really interesting the way that quote gets used, because what he was actually saying is, hey, God is dead, we can't keep living like Christian morality is true. Because if we've killed God, we need to go beyond Christian morality. And what he essentially said is that we need to transcend that and make our own morality, right? We need to become superhumans, get past this divine God that we've anchored our morality to, and find our morality somewhere else. Unfortunately, I don't think Nietzsche...
mad.
Yeah, he also went crazy and died. But unfortunately, a lot of the people who are big fans of Nietzsche's philosophy of transcending traditional Christian morality became European fascists in the 1930s. So that did not go quite as nicely as it could have for Nietzsche and lovers of his philosophical system.
Well, this is all wonderful and beautiful and super deep stuff that we're talking about here. But first of all, what does this have to do with arguments for God? And then second of all, why should I know this? This is really heady stuff.
It can be. Yeah, absolutely. And this is the kind of thing we've been doing for the past 3 episodes, right? We've been dealing like stuff exists. Why must this prove the existence of God? We go through philosophical arguments, objections, arguments against it, whatever, We talked about epistemology. How can the human mind reliably know things? How can we know morality? That's what we're dealing with this time. And consistently throughout those episodes, we've come back to the fact that, hey, it's important to use your brain because God has given it to you as a gift. And you are going to be confronted, if you are a Christian, with people who disagree with Christian morality, right? And if you are not a Christian, as a viewer, you are going to be confronted with the question. I am confronting you with the question now, where is your morality coming from, right? I think everybody needs to ask themselves that question very seriously. Because if you just say, well, it just exists, then...
It just came from my parents, or it just came from my old Catholic church.
Why should you believe it? At the end of the day, is a belief that deeply rooted to who you are, that you haven't even chosen to examine, that you haven't even chosen to root in something solid and steady, is it worth having? Why do you believe what you believe? As a Christian, my values of morality are derived from my faith. They're rooted in something bigger than the physical world that I'm a part of. It is an unchanging, stable God who is fundamentally good that I root my morality in, right? You can go into this discussion without going into the depth that we have. You can go way further than the depth that we have. I mean, this is pretty surface level in terms of like actually digging into the topic of Christian ethics. There are longer books. A lot of what we've talked about today was inspired by and based on Tim Keller's series, Questioning Christianity. He does an episode about morality with a question and answer session that I strongly recommend if you want to get a stronger, more in-depth and academic version of this presented to a secular audience. So that's available. But if we're talking about why this argument for God, we need social consensus. We need personal morality, but we also need a morality to base our societies as a whole on, right? And for us to impose law, we need to have a good justification beyond, well, my preferences are better than your preferences, right? And only a law rooted in God can give us a standard outside of our preferences. And only our Creator has the right to impose his sense of morality on us. We don't have a right to impose that on each other, I don't believe. Only God has a right to impose morality. And that's why it makes sense to believe that your morality comes from a Creator, because your Creator, by all accounts, should have that right. And he knows what you're like. He knows what's good for you, right? He created you for these laws. He didn't create these laws to hurt you. He created these laws to protect you. It makes perfect sense that from where we came from, we derive who we should be.
What if I am running against the standard of morality?
Yeah.
What hope is there for me as a Christian, or maybe as a non-Christian?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And that's the fundamental question at the heart of Christianity, right? I think everyone, to a greater or lesser extent, has a knowledge that there's something wrong with them, that they don't necessarily live up to what they should be, that there's something that they're doing wrong. I think a lot of people carry a certain sense of guilt, right? And that guilt can come from a variety of places. It can come from society. It can come from religion. It can come from just like personal experiences. It comes from your conscience to a large extent. And the Bible makes very clear that all humans have failed to live up to God's morality, have failed to live up to that law of God, that we have lied, that we have cheated, that we have stolen, that we have been sexually immoral, even if we haven't gone all the way and like committed a heinous act of sexual violence, or even if we haven't gone all the way to committed a murder, We have hatred in our hearts. We have lust in our thoughts. We have been dishonest. We have been misleading. We have puffed ourselves up. We have been proud. And we have truly not had God as the highest love of our hearts and treated our neighbor as we want to be treated. That is universal to Christian and to non-Christian. We have failed the law of God. Mm-hmm. But Christianity doesn't leave you there. And that's the important thing. That's the really kind of the big message of Christianity. I think all this talk about morality is really important to talk about the need for God, the philosophical argument that we need a divine moral order. But it leaves us with the question, what happens when we fail that moral order? And Christianity is the only religion that says that God became man and paid the penalty for your failure to keep his law. That God can forgive you, that God can redeem you, that God sacrificed his son so that you could be reunited with him, that God can be both just because he punishes sin and that he punishes our sin on the person of Jesus Christ who came voluntarily to die for our sin and still justify us, still say these people are okay. They have committed horrible wrongs, but I have forgiven them. Yeah. Jesus Christ sits at the intersection between the justice and the mercy of God. He reflects both the justice and the mercy of God in that he suffered because of our unjust behavior and that he rose from the dead to prove that death cannot hold him, that death is not victorious over him. So Tim Keller makes a very strong point of this, is the Christian sense of morality is not rooted in keeping God's law and in being good people and in being better than other people. That is not the Christian sense of morality. The Christian sense of morality is rooted in the fact that we are forgiven, that our failure to obey the moral order is no longer held against us, and that because of that, we live a life of gratitude towards God that involves obedience and becoming more and more like him by the power of the Holy Spirit. And that's where we've once again pivoted from philosophy to faith, right?
Right.
We've talked about that moral order, and we've beaten that horse to death a little bit. But at the end of the day, my question to the viewer, whether Christian or non-Christian, my question to the viewer, whether Christian or non-Christian, is how do you relate to God's moral standards? How do you relate to that sense of right and wrong that's given from beyond us, that our conscience is constantly reminding us about, that our society has so many historical traces of? Now what? Maybe you don't have an answer for the big questions about morality. Maybe you have doubts about this Bible story or that, or challenges about that. But at the end of the day, God's reconciliation with his people is the heart of what's going on in the Christian faith. And that's the most important thing, and that's disruptive. That's absolutely telling the culture, you don't have a standard for morality, and I do, but I also have the solution for morality at the end of the day as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're so glad that you joined us, and thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next episode. Catch you on the flip.
Stay safe out there, folks.
Thank you for listening to the Disruption Podcast, where we disrupt the culture and center Christ. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing on YouTube or following us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram. We'll see you on the next episode.